Some escapes defy all logic. When examined closely, they seem to violate every law of probability, every principle of human endurance, every barrier that cruelty and geography can erect. One of these was Solomon Northup's escape from slavery. Not because he fought his captors or ran through swamps, but because he did something far more impossible. He convinced the very system designed to erase him that he had never ceased to exist. In 1853, a man walked out of a Louisiana plantation carrying nothing but a letter. 12 years earlier, he had been a free citizen of New York. A father, a violinist, a man with legal papers proving his freedom. Then, in a single night in Washington, D.C., he vanished. When he reappeared over a decade later, he had survived something that killed most men within months, the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South, where the average life expectancy of a field slave was 7 years. But here is what makes historians pause. What makes this case so peculiar? It's been studied for over a century. Solomon didn't just survive. He orchestrated an escape so intricate, so dependent on perfect timing and impossible coincidences, that some scholars have spent decades trying to understand how it actually worked. An escape that required a white man to risk his life. A letter to travel hundreds of miles without being intercepted. And a legal system that had every reason to deny his freedom to suddenly, inexplicably, acknowledge it. The details of those 12 years, what Solomon endured, what he witnessed, and, most disturbingly, what he learned about the machinery of slavery, would become one of the most important documents in American history. But the escape itself? That remains a mystery wrapped in questions that have never been fully answered. How does a man survive 12 years of systematic dehumanization without losing himself? How does he maintain hope when every physical, social, and legal barrier tells him there is none? And most puzzling of all, how does he engineer freedom from within a system specifically designed to make freedom impossible? Before we continue with the story of Solomon Northup and the impossible chain of events that led to his freedom, if you enjoy mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about history, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Leave a like if you want more stories that make you question what really happened. And tell us in the comments what state or city you are listening from. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Not in Louisiana, but in a place where Solomon believed he was completely safe. The answers to these questions lie not in a single moment of dramatic escape, but in a series of extraordinary risks, calculated decisions, and coincidences so unlikely they seem almost orchestrated by fate itself. This is the story of how one man refused to be erased, and how the very act of remembering who he was became the key to his survival. Saratoga Springs, New York, in the spring of 1841 was a town that hummed with promise and prosperity. Nestled in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, the town had transformed from a quiet settlement into one of the most fashionable destinations in the northeastern United States. The mineral springs that bubbled up from the earth had been known to the Mohawk people for centuries. But by the 1840s, they had become the foundation of a thriving resort economy that attracted wealthy families from New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and even as far south as Charleston. The summer season brought an influx of visitors who filled the grand hotels that lined Broadway, the United States Hotel, Congress Hall, the Columbian, establishments that rivaled anything in New York City for sophistication and elegance. With the visitors came a demand for entertainment, orchestras, theater companies, dance instructors, and musicians of all kinds. For a skilled violinist, Saratoga Springs in the summer was a place where a man could make a respectable living. Solomon Northup had built exactly that kind of life. At 33 years old, he was a man of medium height and strong build with intelligent eyes and hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years mastering his craft. He had been born in Minerva, New York in July of 1808, the son of Mintus Northup, a freed slave who had been emancipated by his master's will in the 1790s. That single fact, that his father had been legally freed before Solomon's birth, meant that Solomon had been born free, a status that carried significant legal weight in New York State. Mintus Northup had been a farmer, and he had raised his children with a clear understanding of what freedom meant and how fragile it could be. He had taught Solomon to read and write, skills that were not universal even among free black citizens in the early 19th century. He had taught him the importance of documentation, of keeping papers that proved his status, of understanding the law. And he had taught him a trade, music, that would allow him to move through white society with a degree of autonomy and respect that was rare for black men in that era. Solomon had married in Hampton in 1829 when he was 21 years old. and was a woman of mixed heritage, the daughter of a free black woman and a white man, and she possessed a practical intelligence and quiet strength that complemented Solomon's more gregarious nature. Together they had built a life that, while modest by the standards of Saratoga's wealthy visitors, was secure and comfortable by the standards of their community. They had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Elizabeth, the eldest, was 12 years old in the spring of 1841, a bright girl who helped her mother with cooking and household work. Margaret was 10, quieter than her sister, but equally sharp. Alonzo was 7, a boy who showed signs of inheriting his father's musical talent. The family lived in a small house that Solomon owned outright, a significant achievement for any working man in that era, and especially for a free black man. Solomon's reputation as a musician had spread throughout the region. He played the violin with a skill that came from natural talent and years of practice. He performed at weddings, holiday celebrations, political gatherings, and the elaborate balls that were held at the grand hotels during the summer season. He knew the popular pieces of the day, waltzes, reels, contradances, and he could read sheet music, which allowed him to learn new pieces quickly. His clients included some of the most prominent families in the area: judges, lawyers, merchants, politicians. They knew him by name and they trusted him. This reputation was more than just a source of income. In a society where free black citizens existed in a precarious social and legal position, reputation was a form of protection. Solomon was known as a skilled, reliable, respectable man. He kept his word. He paid his debts. And he caused no trouble. Local officials knew him. The sheriff knew him. The judges who presided over the county courts knew him. This network of respect and recognition was in many ways more valuable than the free papers he kept carefully stored in his home. And worked primarily as a cook in the hotels and private homes of wealthy families. She was known for her ability to manage large meals for parties and gatherings and for her skill with traditional dishes. During the summer season, when Saratoga was at its busiest, she could earn significant wages. During the winter, work was scarcer and the family lived more frugally, but they managed. The Northup family attended the local Baptist church where they were part of a small but established community of free black families. There were perhaps 50 or 60 free black residents in Saratoga Springs in 1841, most of them working as servants, laborers, cooks, or craftsmen. They lived in a society that was, by the standards of the time, relatively tolerant. New York had abolished slavery gradually between 1799 and 1827. And by 1841, the state had a significant population of free black citizens who possessed legal rights, including the right to own property, to sue in court, and to vote if they met certain property requirements. But tolerance was not the same as equality. And Solomon was acutely aware of the boundaries that circumscribed his life. He could play music at the grand hotels, but he could not stay in them as a guest. He could vote, but only because he owned property. Most black men in New York could not meet the property requirements that had been specifically designed to limit their political power. He could walk the streets freely, but he knew that if he traveled south, even into neighboring states like Pennsylvania or New Jersey, his freedom papers might not be respected. And he knew that there were men, kidnappers, who specialized in capturing free black people and selling them into slavery in the South, who operated even in northern states. This was the world Solomon Northup inhabited in March of 1841. A world of relative security built on documentation, reputation, and careful navigation of social boundaries. It was a world that felt predictable, stable, safe. And it was about to be shattered completely. The offer came in late March, just as the winter was beginning to loosen its grip on upstate New York. 2 men approached Solomon in Saratoga Springs, introducing themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They were well-dressed, affable, and they spoke with the confidence of men who were accustomed to conducting business. They explained that they were members of a traveling circus company that was making its way south through New York State and into Washington, D.C. The circus featured acrobats, trained horses, and various entertainments, and they needed a musician to accompany the performances. They had heard of Solomon's reputation as a violinist, they said, and they were prepared to offer him generous terms, $1 per day, plus all expenses paid. The tour would last only a few weeks. They would travel through Albany down to New York City and then to Washington, D.C., where the circus would perform for several days before returning north. Solomon would be back in Saratoga Springs by early April, well before the summer season began. It was an attractive offer. $1 per day was good wages, and the expenses would be covered, meaning Solomon could save most of what he earned. And was preparing to leave for Sandy Hill, a town about 30 miles north, where she had secured a position as a cook for a wealthy family. The children would be staying with relatives. The timing seemed perfect. Solomon would be away for a few weeks earning money, and he would return just as Anne came back and the summer season began. He discussed it with Anne. She was cautious by nature, and she asked the questions that any prudent person would ask. Did he know these men? Could he trust them? Did he have the offer in writing? Solomon admitted that he had only just met Brown and Hamilton, but they seemed legitimate. They were well-spoken. They had money. And they had provided references from other musicians who had worked with the circus. As for a written contract, such things were not always standard for short-term employment, especially in the entertainment business. And was not entirely convinced, but she also understood the practical realities of their situation. The money would be useful. Solomon was an experienced traveler. He had performed throughout the region, and he knew how to take care of himself. And he would have his free papers with him, documentation that proved his status as a free man. If there were any problems, any questions, he could produce the papers and resolve the situation. Solomon decided to accept the offer. He packed a small bag with his violin, clothes, and his free papers, a document that had been issued by the county clerk and bore official seals and signatures. The papers described him in detail: his age, his height, his complexion, his status as a freeman born in New York. They were his protection, his proof of identity, his insurance. On March 20, 1841, Solomon Northup left Saratoga Springs with Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. He kissed Anne goodbye, promised to write when he reached Washington, and set off on what he believed would be a profitable, brief journey. He had no reason to suspect that he would not see his family again for 12 years. He had no reason to believe that the two affable men traveling with him were anything other than what they claimed to be. And he had no way of knowing that his free papers, the documents he trusted to protect him, would be worthless the moment he crossed into Washington, D.C. The journey south was pleasant. They traveled by stagecoach and steamboat, stopping in Albany, and then New York City. Brown and Hamilton were good company, and they paid Solomon promptly for his performances. In New York City, they stayed at a hotel near the docks, and Solomon played for small audiences in gathering halls and taverns. The circus performances were modest but well attended, and Solomon's violin playing was received with appreciation. From New York City, they traveled by steamboat down the coast and then up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. The capital city in 1841 was a strange mix of raw reality and grand ambitions. The Capitol building and the White House stood as symbols of the young nation's aspirations, but much of the city was still undeveloped: muddy streets, scattered buildings, and a transient population of politicians, lobbyists, and workers who came and went with the congressional sessions. Washington was also, paradoxically, one of the largest slave trading centers in the United States. Despite being the seat of the federal government, the city permitted slavery, and it hosted several slave pens where people were held before being transported and sold to plantations in the Deep South. The domestic slave trade was a massive industry in the 1840s, driven by the cotton boom in states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The demand for labor was so high that traders paid premium prices for slaves. And this created a lucrative market for kidnapping free black people in the North and selling them in the South. Solomon knew about the slave trade, but he believed his free papers would protect him. He had traveled before, and he had never had problems. Washington was the nation's capital, after all. Surely the law would be respected there. Brown and Hamilton arranged lodging at a hotel near the Capitol. On their second evening in the city, March 24, 1841, they invited Solomon to join them for dinner at a nearby tavern. It was a celebration, they said. The circus performances had gone well, and they wanted to mark the occasion. They ordered drinks and food, and the conversation was jovial. Solomon drank wine, something he did only occasionally, and he remembered feeling unusually warm, then dizzy. He excused himself, thinking he needed fresh air, but the dizziness intensified. He remembered stumbling, feeling hands supporting him, and then nothing. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Darkness, pain, the sound of chains, the smell of damp stone. Solomon tried to move and discovered that his ankles and wrists were shackled. His head throbbed with a pain so intense that thinking was difficult. He called out and his voice echoed in the darkness. Gradually, his eyes adjusted and he could make out the shapes of stone walls, a heavy wooden door with a small barred window, and the forms of other people lying on the floor around him. He was in a slave pen. And according to the men who now controlled his fate, he had always been a slave. The slave pen was located on 7th Street in Washington, D.C., less than a mile from the Capitol building. It was owned and operated by James Birch, a professional slave trader who had been in the business for years. The pen was one of several such facilities in the city, and it operated openly with the full knowledge and tacit approval of local authorities. In 1841, slavery was legal in Washington, D.C., and the slave trade was a legitimate, if morally contested, business. The pen itself was a grim structure, a 2-story brick building with heavy doors and barred windows. The ground floor contained several large rooms where enslaved people were held while awaiting sale or transport. The conditions were deliberately harsh: constant surveillance, no bedding, minimal food. The purpose was not just containment, but demoralization, to break the spirit of anyone who might resist or claim they were free. Solomon's first clear memory after waking in the pen was of James Birch standing over him. Birch was a man in his 40s, well-dressed in the manner of a successful businessman, with cold eyes and a demeanor that suggested he had done this many times before. He asked Solomon his name. Solomon, still disoriented but beginning to understand the horror of his situation, told Birch the truth. His name was Solomon Northup. He was a freeman from Saratoga Springs, New York. He had papers proving his freedom. There had been a terrible mistake, and he needed to contact his lawyer, his family, anyone who could verify his identity. Birch's response was methodical and calm. He informed Solomon that his name was not Solomon Northup. His name was Platt. He was a runaway slave from Georgia, and he had been captured and returned to his rightful owner. Any claims to the contrary were lies, and lies would be punished. Solomon insisted. He described his wife, his home, his children. He named officials, merchants, judges in Saratoga Springs who could vouch for him. He demanded to see his free papers, which he had carried with him from New York. Birch listened to all of this without expression. Then he left the room and returned with 2 other men and a wooden paddle. What followed was a beating so severe that Solomon lost consciousness. When he woke, he was alone in the cell, his legs and back covered in welts and cuts. He tried to move and discovered that even breathing was painful. Over the next few hours, as the pain subsided enough for him to think clearly, Solomon began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Brown and Hamilton had drugged him. The wine at dinner had been laced with something, probably laudanum or another opiate. While he was unconscious, they had taken his free papers and sold him to Birch. The papers were now hidden or destroyed, and without them, Solomon had no way to prove his identity. In the eyes of the law, he was now property. Birch had documentation, bills of sale, ownership papers that identified him as a slave named Platt. Solomon's word, the word of a black man claiming to be free, meant nothing against Birch's legal documents. Even if Solomon could somehow get a message to someone in New York, even if someone came looking for him, Birch's papers would be accepted as legitimate, unless Solomon could produce his own documentation to counter them. And his documentation no longer existed. The other people in the pen told Solomon the truth he was beginning to realize. This happened all the time. Free black people were kidnapped in northern cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, drugged or beaten into submission and sold to traders like Birch. The traders had networks of accomplices who identified targets, lured them with job offers or other pretexts, and delivered them to the pens. Once in the pen, the victims' free papers were destroyed, and they were given new identities as slaves. Within days or weeks, they were sold and transported south, where they disappeared into the vast plantation system of the Deep South. The legal system offered no protection. In Washington, D.C., as in most of the country, the testimony of black people was not admissible in court against white people. Even if Solomon could somehow bring charges against Birch or Brown and Hamilton, he could not testify. And without testimony, there was no case. The system was designed to protect property rights, and in this system, Solomon was property. Solomon spent 2 weeks in Birch's pen. During that time, he was beaten twice more for insisting he was free. The beatings were not random acts of cruelty. They were calculated to break his will. Birch wanted slaves who were compliant, who had accepted their status, who would not cause trouble for the buyers. Resistance was punished swiftly and brutally. But the beatings also taught Solomon something crucial. He could not win by fighting. The system was too entrenched, too powerful. If he was going to survive, if he was ever going to escape, he would have to be smarter. He would have to play the role of the compliant slave while secretly maintaining his sense of self, his memory of who he was. He would have to wait for an opportunity, however unlikely, to prove his freedom. In early April, Solomon was transported from Washington to Richmond, Virginia, along with a group of about 40 other enslaved people. They were chained together in pairs and marched through the streets of Washington in broad daylight, past government offices, past the Capitol building, past citizens who watched with approval or indifference. The domestic slave trade was so normalized in Washington that such scenes were unremarkable. In Richmond, they were held in another slave pen for several days before being loaded onto a ship called the Orleans. The ship was bound for New Orleans, the largest slave market in the Deep South. The voyage took nearly 2 weeks, and the conditions were horrific. The enslaved people were kept below deck in a space so cramped that they could barely move. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of human waste and sweat. They were given minimal water and food, and several people became ill. 2 people died during the voyage, a young woman who had been sick when they boarded, and an older man who simply seemed to give up. Their bodies were brought up on deck and thrown overboard without prayer, without ceremony, without acknowledgement that they had been human beings with histories and names. Solomon watched this and understood that he was witnessing a system of dehumanization so thorough, so complete, that it could reduce people to cargo, to units of economic value, to things that could be discarded when they lost their utility. And he understood that if he was going to survive, he would have to resist this dehumanization in the only way available to him. By holding on, by remembering, by holding on to his sense of self, his past, his identity, even if he could never speak it aloud. They arrived in New Orleans in late April 1841. The city was the commercial heart of the Deep South, a bustling port where slaves, sugar, and cotton were bought and sold in massive quantities. The slave market was located near the docks, a series of open yards and buildings where traders displayed their human merchandise to prospective buyers. Solomon and the others were taken to one of these markets, a facility owned by a trader named Theophilus Freeman. They were given new clothes, cleaned, and instructed on how to behave when buyers came to inspect them. Freeman was explicit. They were to look compliant, strong, and healthy. Any sign of injury, illness, or resistance would lower their value. Anyone who caused problems would be beaten. For several days, Solomon stood in Freeman's yard while buyers examined him. They inspected his muscles, his hands, his teeth. They asked him questions about his experience with farm work, his health, his age. Solomon answered carefully, saying as little as possible, trying to appear neither too ignorant nor too intelligent. Intelligence made buyers suspicious. Educated slaves were considered dangerous. But ignorance made them less valuable for certain types of work. Finally, in early May, Solomon was purchased by a man named William Ford. Ford was a Baptist preacher who owned several thousand acres of pine forest and a lumber mill in the Bayou Boeuf region of central Louisiana. He paid $1,000 for Solomon, a significant sum that reflected Solomon's apparent strength and health. Ford was, by the standards of the time and place, considered a relatively humane master. He did not use the whip excessively. He provided adequate shelter and food, and he allowed his slaves to attend religious services. But Ford was still a slaveholder, and his humanity existed entirely within the framework of a system that treated people as property. He owned Solomon, and that ownership was absolute. Solomon was transported to Ford's plantation, a journey of several days by wagon and boat through the forests and swamps of central Louisiana. The landscape was unlike anything he had seen in New York: dense pine forests, vast expanses of cypress swamps, and an oppressive heat that made every movement exhausting. The plantation itself was isolated, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by rough roads that turned to mud in the frequent rains. Ford put Solomon to work in the lumber operation, cutting and transporting pine logs. The work was hard, but Solomon was strong, and he quickly learned the rhythms of the job. Ford recognized Solomon's intelligence and began giving him more responsibility, managing logistics, supervising other workers, solving problems. For a few months, Solomon allowed himself to hope that Ford might be different, that he might listen if Solomon told him the truth about his past. But Solomon also observed Ford carefully, and what he saw was a man trapped in his own contradictions. Ford was genuinely religious, and he seemed to believe that slavery could be practiced in a Christian manner, that masters had a duty to treat their slaves with a degree of kindness and to provide for their spiritual welfare. But he never questioned the fundamental premise of slavery itself. He never considered that owning another human being might be incompatible with Christian teaching. And he never showed any sign that he would risk his own social standing or financial interests to help a slave claim freedom. Solomon decided to wait. He would watch for an opportunity, but he would not reveal his past to Ford. The risk was too great. If Ford didn't believe him, or if Ford reported him to the authorities, Solomon could be sold to a harsher master or even killed as a troublemaker. The opportunity never came. In late 1842, Ford fell into financial difficulties. He had borrowed money to expand his lumber operation and he could not repay the debts. His creditors demanded payment and Ford was forced to sell assets, including some of his slaves. Solomon was sold to a carpenter named John Tibbotts to satisfy one of Ford's debts. The sale was a turning point. If Ford had represented the best that slavery could offer, a master who was not gratuitously cruel, who provided basic necessities, who acknowledged the humanity of his slaves even while denying their freedom, then Tibbotts represented something far darker. Tibbotts was a violent, unstable man who seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain. He beat his slaves for no reason at all, for perceived disrespect, for minor infractions. He was particularly hostile to Solomon, perhaps sensing that Solomon was more intelligent, more educated than the role he was playing. The conflict came to a head one day in the summer of 1843. Tibbotts accused Solomon of doing work incorrectly, a trivial matter, a misunderstanding about how to construct a fence. But Tibbotts used it as a pretext to beat Solomon with a whip. Solomon, pushed beyond endurance, fought back. He wrestled the whip away from Tibbotts and struck him several times before other workers pulled them apart. It was an act of self-defense, but under Louisiana law, it was a capital crime. A slave who struck a white man could be executed, and the execution could be carried out by the master without trial. Tibbotts, humiliated and enraged, left to get a rope, making it clear that he intended to hang Solomon. Solomon ran. He fled into the swamps that surrounded the plantation, wading through water that was waist-deep, hiding among the Spanish moss and cypress trees. He spent the night in the swamp, surrounded by alligators and snakes, listening to the sounds of men searching for him with dogs. He knew that if they caught him, he would be killed. But he also knew that he could not survive in the swamp indefinitely. He had no shelter, no food, and the swamp was full of dangers. At dawn, desperate and exhausted, Solomon made a decision that seemed insane, but was perhaps his only chance. He returned to Ford's plantation and begged for protection. Ford, who still technically owned a portion of Solomon's value as collateral for the debt Tibbotts owed him, intervened. He negotiated with Tibbotts and eventually a solution was reached. Solomon would be sold again, this time to a planter named Edwin Epps. It was not safety. It was not freedom. But it was survival. And for Solomon, survival was the only form of resistance available. Edwin Epps's plantation was located deep in the Bayou Boeuf region, a remote area of central Louisiana characterized by forests, swamps, and scattered cotton plantations. The plantation itself was a world unto itself, isolated, self-contained, and governed by Epps's absolute authority. For Solomon, arriving at Epps's plantation in late 1843 marked the beginning of a new phase of his captivity, one that would last for nearly 10 years and test the limits of his endurance. Epps was a man in his early 40s, of wiry build and medium height, with a face that seemed perpetually set in an expression of anger and suspicion. He had been born poor, the son of a small farmer, and he had clawed his way to a position of relative prosperity through ruthless business practices, hard work, and an absolute belief in the racial hierarchy that justified slavery. He owned about 10 slaves when Solomon arrived, and he worked them with a brutality that was extreme, even by the standards of the antebellum South. Epps's philosophy of slave management was simple and brutal. Slaves were property no different from livestock, and they existed solely to generate profit. He measured their worth by the amount of cotton they could pick in a day, and he enforced his expectations with the whip. Every evening, the slaves were required to weigh their cotton. Those who had picked less than their assigned quota, typically 200 pounds for an adult, were whipped. The number of lashes corresponded to the number of pounds they were short. It was a nightly ritual as predictable as sunset, and it created an atmosphere of constant fear. Solomon learned to pick cotton, though he was never as fast as those who had been doing it since childhood. Cotton picking was skilled labor requiring technique, endurance, and speed. The bolls had to be plucked cleanly without including too much of the plant material, and the work had to be done quickly because the picking season was short, only a few months between when the bolls ripened and when the weather turned. A skilled picker could harvest 300 pounds or more in a day. Solomon, despite his intelligence and strength, struggled to reach 200, especially in the early years. The whippings were not the only form of control. Epps also used psychological tactics to maintain dominance. He encouraged distrust and competition among the slaves, rewarding those who informed on others and punishing those who showed solidarity. He would sometimes force slaves to whip each other, making them complicit in the system of violence. And he used sexual violence as a tool of power, particularly against the women on the plantation. One of the enslaved women on Epps's plantation was named Patsy. She was in her early 20s when Solomon arrived. A woman of extraordinary beauty and even more extraordinary skill as a cotton picker. She could harvest 500 pounds in a day, far more than anyone else, and this made her valuable to Epps, but it also made her a target. Epps developed an obsession with Patsy, and he subjected her to repeated sexual assaults. His wife, Mary Epps, was aware of this and responded not by confronting her husband, but by directing her rage at Patsy, treating her with vicious cruelty and demanding that Epps punish her for imagined infractions. Solomon witnessed this and understood that he was living in a system where every human relationship was distorted by the fundamental violence of slavery. Mary Epps's jealous rage, Epps's obsession with Patsy, the forced complicity of the other slaves, all of it was a product of a system that treated people as property and gave masters absolute power over their lives. But Solomon also observed something else. The plantation was isolated, but it was not entirely cut off from the outside world. Occasionally, white men from outside the region would visit, traders, craftsmen hired to do specialized work, overseers. These men brought different perspectives, gossip, and news. And Solomon began to understand that if he was ever going to escape, it would not be by running through the swamps. It would be by finding someone from outside the system, someone who might be willing to help him get a message to New York. The years passed slowly. Solomon worked in the fields, picked cotton, endured the whip, and played the role of the compliant slave. He never spoke of his past, never claimed to be free, never gave Epps any reason to suspect that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. But internally, he held on to his identity. He remembered his children's names, his wife's face, the music he had played, the streets of Saratoga Springs. He recited these memories to himself like prayers, using them to maintain his sense of self in a world designed to erase it. He also observed the social and legal structures that made escape nearly impossible. Louisiana law required all black people to carry passes signed by their masters if they traveled alone. Without a pass, any white person could stop you, demand proof of your status, and return you to your owner for a reward. The roads were patrolled by men who made their living catching runaways. And the swamps that surrounded the plantation were vast and deadly. Men who ran into the swamps rarely came out alive. But the greatest barrier was not physical. It was legal. Solomon had no papers. He had no way to prove he had ever been free. Even if he could somehow reach New York, he would be traveling as a fugitive slave, subject to arrest under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required northern states to return escaped slaves to their owners. And Epps, like all slaveholders, had legal documentation proving his ownership. In any confrontation between Solomon's word and Epps's papers, the law would side with Epps. Solomon understood this with perfect clarity. He had watched other slaves try to escape and fail. He had seen men return to the plantation and beaten so severely they never recovered. He had seen women sold away from their children as punishment for attempting to run. He knew that escape in the traditional sense was impossible. So he began to consider a different kind of escape, one that didn't involve running at all. If he could not escape slavery, perhaps he could prove he had never legally been a slave in the first place. To do that, he would need to get a message to someone in New York who could verify his identity and bring legal proof of his freedom to Louisiana. But how? He couldn't write a letter himself. If Epps discovered he was literate, the consequences would be severe. Educated slaves were considered dangerous and they were often killed or sold further south. He couldn't trust other slaves with the information. The risk of betrayal, whether under torture or intentional, was too high. He couldn't approach white people in the area. Most were connected to the plantation system and would report him immediately. He needed someone from outside Louisiana, someone who had no stake in the system, someone who might be willing to take an enormous risk for a stranger. And for years, no such person appeared. Then in the summer of 1852, a white carpenter named Samuel Bass arrived at Epps's plantation to do construction work. Samuel Bass was a man in his late 40s, tall and lean with a weathered face and graying hair that spoke of years spent working outdoors. He was originally from Canada, and he had spent much of his adult life traveling throughout the southern United States working as a builder and carpenter. He was skilled at his trade, and he had a reputation for quality work, which meant he was in demand despite his tendency to speak his mind on subjects that most white Southerners considered settled. Bass was an abolitionist. He believed that slavery was economically inefficient, morally wrong, and incompatible with the principles of democracy and Christianity. These were dangerous opinions in Louisiana in 1852, where slavery was not just an economic system, but the foundation of social order. White Southerners who questioned slavery were viewed with hostility and suspicion. And those who actively opposed it could face social ostracism, legal prosecution, or violence. But Bass seemed unable or unwilling to keep his opinions to himself. He would argue with slaveholders, pointing out the contradictions in their justifications for slavery. He would cite economic theory, the Declaration of Independence, the Bible, anything he could use to make his case. Most slaveholders dismissed him as an eccentric, a harmless crank whose opinions were too absurd to take seriously, but some found him genuinely threatening, and Bass had been run out of more than one town for his views. Epps had hired Bass to build an addition to his house, a project that would take several weeks. Bass arrived in late July 1852 and set up a temporary workshop near the main house. He worked alone most of the time, but occasionally he would interact with the enslaved people on the plantation, asking them to hold boards while he worked or help carry materials. Solomon watched Bass carefully from the beginning. He observed how Bass spoke to the slaves, not with the casual contempt that most white men used, but with a basic courtesy that suggested he saw them as people rather than property. He listened when Bass got into arguments with Epps about slavery, debates that would take place in the evenings after work, often fueled by whiskey. In one such argument which Solomon overheard while working near the house, Bass told Epps that slavery was a sin against man and God, that it degraded both the enslaver and the enslaved, and that it would eventually destroy the South. Epps responded with the standard defenses. Black people were inferior and needed white guidance. Slavery was sanctioned by the Bible. The economy of the South depended on slave labor. Bass countered every point, his voice rising with passion until Epps finally told him to shut up or leave. Bass didn't leave. He finished his whiskey, muttered something about Epps being a fool, and went back to his work the next morning as if nothing had happened. Solomon watched this exchange and began to consider a possibility that seemed both terrifying and promising. Bass might be willing to help him. But the risk was enormous. If Solomon revealed his past to Bass, and if Bass reported him to Epps, Solomon would be beaten, possibly killed. Even if Bass was genuinely opposed to slavery, that didn't mean he would risk his own safety for a slave he barely knew. And even if Bass agreed to help, there was no guarantee that any plan would succeed. Solomon spent weeks observing Bass, trying to assess his courage, his reliability, his character. He watched how Bass treated the other slaves, how he responded when Epps was cruel, how he conducted himself when he thought no one was watching. And gradually Solomon came to believe that Bass was genuine, that his opposition to slavery was not just rhetoric, but a deeply held conviction. But belief was not certainty, and Solomon knew he would only have one chance. If he approached Bass and Bass refused to,